Okay, I think we should get started. I think everything's working right. I've got Chrome set up to gather captions for this presentation as we go. So let's hope it works and is not too distracting. So hello, everybody. Welcome to our active bystander orientation. I'm Scout Calvert, and I'm going to be joined by the rest of our subcommittee as we move through this presentation. We've put some materials on the DLF forum website for you for people who wanted to dip their toes in before this session. So I've put that link on the community notes page along with a link to the code of conduct. So someone is going to drop that link into the chat so that you can get it, and we'll drop it in again later because if people come in later, they won't be able to see that chat. So you can use this notes document to drop in questions for group discussion that we're going to have at the end of the session. So hopefully you've had a chance to either read the DLF Code of Conduct on the website or listen to the video that we linked on our session page. But either way, everyone is welcome, and we're going to try to conduct this session to help people get something out of it, whether they're familiar with the concept of bystander intervention or not. So you can see who we are here on our introduction slide. I'm Scout Calvert. We're in alphabetical order here on the slide, not the order that we're going in. So I want to give you a little bit of background on why we put this together. For a couple of years now, some of us have wanted to share information about bystander intervention in preparation for the DLF forum. And last year, the forum was held in Las Vegas. So we wanted to plan ahead to watch, to help watch out for each other in a place where a lot of people, maybe people not necessarily connected to the conference, might be compromised because of the cut loose reputation of Las Vegas. But we ran out of time to do anything more than share some materials about active bystander strategies. Instead, we committed to preparing an information session or an information kit for the following year, and that's this year. And since then, there have been some high-profile failures of codes of conduct at professional and academic conferences. And I think that helped us resolve to really get this out this year. So I want us to go into this session with a little bit of encouragement about the world and our ability to witness or even stand up for others. The world can seem pretty callous sometimes, so it may feel risky to respond to a situation. But it turns out that most people choose to intervene, according to the study that you see linked on the slide. Most people don't just stand idly by. Intervention is actually the norm. So to get us started, I'm going to give an overview of this session and then pass it off to our next presenter. But before that, I have a disclaimer. So I'll reiterate that at the forum, you can always talk to people with white lanyards. Beyond that, we can't give legal advice or tell people that they should intervene. Strategies for active bystander intervention relate to nonviolent communication, self-defense, personal safety, and other skill sets that we're not expert in. And there's also the bigger conversations about implicit bias and microaggression that we all need to have. So the purpose of this orientation is to provide an introduction to these ideas for personal reflection and empowerment. We can't endorse any specific course of action, but we can provide a space to talk through some scenarios and apply principles to them. Just like using your GPS for driving, always do a reality check before taking any unmarked roads. So here's our learning outcomes, what we hope to get from this session. What we hope to be able to empower people to reflect on their personal philosophies and their preparedness to intervene, share some basic information and tactics to address situations when we're part of one, help people understand their own comfort levels and assess risks and then choose interventions that feel like they balance those. Discuss and reflect on types of behavior that could create an unwelcoming environment, and anticipate scenarios of the kind that could happen in a professional situation to help us support inclusive participation at DLF Forum. So here's our agenda. So we're going to talk about active bystander concepts, talk about risks and fears that people may have in trying to decide whether to intervene, review some of the kinds of common professional encounters in professional contexts, talk about the concept of boundaries and agency as a way of thinking about intervening, And then we're going to provide some strategies, so some do's and some don'ts, and then something that is called the 5 Ds, and you'll see what those are. Then as we wrap up, we're going to talk about the communication recovery model, and then that will steer us into discussion at the end. So a reminder, please add your questions for discussion into the notes document, and someone will drop that into the chat again. And we'll have the discussion at the end so that we can move through the material. There's a lot to discuss. So let's get started, and I'm gonna pass the baton on to Melissa.
Melissa, can you turn your microphone on?
Okay. Did anybody hear anything?
No, sorry, start over.
Okay, all right. So I just want to lead us through a few initial concepts of active bystandership by sharing that in recent years, the idea of intervention or being an active bystander continues to receive greater exposure. A number of organizations offer this type of training, and in this session, we are bringing together insights from sources including Hollaback, American Friends Service Committee, and Irvin Staub's TAB training, TAB. The concepts behind active bystandership do not aim to immediately educate or change standing patterns of individual behavior. Its primary objective is to safely diminish or diffuse the negative or potentially harmful situation. It is important to acknowledge that as either a non-active or active bystander, you are part of the situation. Non-active means you witness behavior and do not choose to act. Active bystander means you opt to intervene. Both approaches have risks associated with them. Not being active can lead to normalization of the behavior you are witnessing. For example, if someone doesn't choose to speak up when a sexist or racist remark is made at work. And being an active bystander may put you at physical risk depending on the specific situation. So if or when you notice an individual is behaving in a manner that is disrespectful, harmful, or even violent, this active bystander training can help you determine what is the best approach for the particular situation. For instance, whether to deflect, diffuse, or defer the situation. And these approaches will be discussed in detail later in this session. It is essential to remember that no matter which approach you select, the goal is for the person on the receiving end of the negative behavior to have the chance to remove themselves from the situation and for all parties to remain unharmed. And now I will turn it over to Sarah and go back on mute.
Thank you, Melissa. So why is it a good thing to intervene? Melissa talked a little bit about the purpose of intervention. What does a bystander, an active bystander, serve? So the most important purpose is to reduce harm in the moment. You're going to do something that stops a particular behavior, or you're going to speak out if a boundary is crossed. But either way, what you're trying to do is put a halt to harm in that moment. Another important purpose of intervention is to demonstrate an alternative to other observers or bystanders. The most likely thing to happen at a professional conference like the DLF is a verbal or argumentative interaction. And by being an active bystander, there's the potential to create a space or an opportunity to encourage others to possibly help in the moment. You might empower other observers or bystanders who are there and may want to help, but could be hesitating. It's important to remember, as Melissa pointed out, that doing nothing sends a message. And I want to pause here for a second and just say that by stating this, this is not meant as criticism or prejudgment for someone deciding not to intervene. But we need to recognize that when we encounter and are in the presence of harmful interactions, but we don't speak up, it can send an implicit message that this is okay. Could have an effect of allowing a behavior to continue if someone is perpetrating it, and they could go on, decide, you know, I haven't been stopped before, I could just keep going on. And it can have a deep affect on someone who has been harmed, and that they have to deal with the fact that no one said or did anything in the moment. Another reason, which sort of bleeds into that, is that we want to model and reinforce positive engagement. If the most important thing is to stop someone from being harmed in the moment, we should remember that we are also, as members of the community, demonstrating to others what is possible and what is acceptable within our community. That kind of demonstration of responsibility to one another, and that kind of action and energy that you put out in the world, can be very positive and powerful. And it could have an effect even if you don't see it in the moment. Within the context of the DLF, we want to try to reinforce and uphold the code of conduct. So if collectively we want to be a healthy and welcoming community, then an understanding of intervention is one thing that can help. I like to think of the code of conduct as a framework for understanding how we are expected to interact with one another when we're at the DLF. And then I can apply the concept and practice of being an active bystander as a tactic or a tool in my toolbox for participating. The DLF is a community, and within every community are different viewpoints and people who have different ways of being in the world. And sometimes there can be friction when people are exposed to unfamiliar ideas, and everyone, all of us are, as different people, come together in one place. To understand and be ready to be an active bystander is to be perceptive of yourself and of others in the community. And it helps you bring a commitment to being involved and aware of what's going on around you when we come together as DLF. And all of this obviously contributes to a successful DLF, right? So we want to bring this awareness, and we want it to contribute to everyone being able to make the most out of the conference. And now I'm going to pass it on to Margaret.
Hi, everyone. All of that said, it's really important to acknowledge that it can be a bit of a challenge for many of us to get past internal resistance and participate in a situation when there are a lot of unknowns, sometimes swirling quickly around us. The reasons for not intervening can be really personal, and they need to be respected. It's an individual choice to become an active bystander, but knowing that you're part of a broader community of support can make all the difference when you're considering whether to take that step. So we want to take a moment here and consider some common reasons, risks, and fears for not getting involved, to kind of let them breathe a little bit. And the first is just not knowing what to do, or not being 100% certain that someone in crisis actually wants help. I mean, that's hard to think about sometimes, but these thoughts go through everyone's mind, I think, in the middle of a difficult situation. It's also true that it's human nature to worry about getting it wrong, or worry about looking bad in a crowd. And then there's this sort of attendant fear of being the first to act. I think it's very easy to believe that someone else will take responsibility. Then you get a little bit deeper into it, and you worry about possibly making things worse or exacerbating the conflict for the victim. And if that happened, being able to maintain physical safety for not only yourself, but everybody else in range of the situation in progress is a very legitimate concern. Then if you think about your own past, sometimes previous traumas can be triggered, so you want to be careful about that and thinking about taking care of yourself. Personal repercussions get into kind of a different category. This could take many different forms, but the shock of seeing someone you know, a colleague or a friend that you otherwise respect behaving badly can be a bit of a jolt. So calling out that behavior can put the relationship at risk. Then there's professional blowback, which is a different thing. The possibility of putting your own job, your reputation, or your influence at risk because you're publicly demonstrating your disapproval of what's going on. Then there's power dynamics. The person who may be harming others might have more power in your organization or profession, and you feel vulnerable against that idea. What we really hope for this orientation is that it will help people explore their own internal struggles and hurdles and strategies, and then feel empowered to safely intervene in a way that matches not only the situation, but individual comfort levels. We also want people to know that they're not alone when they worry about risks. Everyone does. It's more helpful than you might think to try to assess the risk and safety before getting involved. And I'm now turning it over to Jasmine.
So, in order to really think through what ways and the different ways in which one could intervene, it's really helpful to really start by understanding the types of encounters you can actually have at a professional conference on just a broad scale. So there can be interpersonal encounters between attendees and colleagues, and attendees and local staff. So not just the people in the same field as you, but the people who are actually doing the work to ensure that your conference is running smoothly, right? Through the hotel or just people who live in the area. There can be session interactions between moderators and attendees, moderators and presenters and attendees. And there can also be broader, larger scale interactions between organizers / the organization and members / more broadly membership. Next slide, please. Additionally, on top of the types of encounters, we really need to talk about boundaries. Often we talk about freezing in the moment. In science, the act of freezing is referred to as tonic immobility and is thought to be associated with extreme stress or fear. And it's usually indicative that some sort of boundary has been crossed. So these are just some examples, but there can be emotional boundaries that have been crossed, mental boundaries that have been crossed, intellectual boundaries that have been crossed, right? If someone steals an idea and you realize that someone's being plagiarized or ignored, physical boundaries, when someone's being physically assaulted or even just touched or having their space invaded in ways. Financial boundaries, if you think about theft or fraud. Cultural boundaries, where we talk about microaggressions, that's oftentimes part of that as well. And organizational policies, if someone's outright violating the code of conduct or just breaking DLF or code of conduct expectations. Next slide, please. So, you are not always, intervening may not always be the correct approach for you. And let's talk about some things that you should or you could consider when deciding whether or not you need to intervene. First, you need to determine who is being harassed. So asking yourself whose boundary was crossed, what type of harassment they're experiencing. So what type of boundary was crossed? And then who's in charge of moderating that form of interaction? So who's responsible for enforcing that? Is this a legal issue? Should the police be called? Is this a policy or CFC violation? Should you be getting someone in a white lanyard? Is there a situation where there's no concrete legal or policy-based violation? We're talking about a microaggression, and maybe it is something that you should say or deal with yourself, or something that you should bring attention to, maybe. Next slide, please. So let's say you've thought these things through and you've decided that intervention is needed. Some things that you should keep in mind are, one, you should be taking cues from the individual harassed. So if that person is resisting in their own way, make sure that you are honoring that. But with that, we mean things like not tone policing, but also if someone seems to not want the police involved or not wants you to get a lanyard, just wants to leave the situation alone, take cues from them. If they are already intervening in their own ways and calling the police or handling things, just let them follow their lead. Make your presence as a witness known. So make eye contact with that person, ask them if they want support. This is just following up and feeding into this, take cues from them. When speaking, do use I statements as opposed to accusatory you statements. This is more of a de-escalation to avoid causing the person to become defensive or aggressive in any way. So hey, I've noticed, or I feel this, as opposed to you're doing this. And keep both of you safe. So assess the surroundings, think about the situation. Is there someone else you can call in? Just really think about keeping, as was said earlier, negating harm. Some things you definitely don't want to do. Don't call the police unless absolutely necessary. This is part of really assessing who is responsible. So it's twofold. Assessing, is this a legal issue? Are the police responsible for this? And two, following the lead of the person. So that person may not be comfortable dealing with the police for a number of reasons. Really looking at the person and following their lead and ensuring that you are only calling the police when absolutely necessary. Don't escalate the situation. This kind of goes with that I versus you statement. The goal is to get the person being harassed to safety, not to incite further violence from the attacker. And don't do nothing. We said this before, violence is kind of a tacit approval. Silence is a tacit approval. It communicates that the behavior is normalized and acceptable, and it leaves the victim high and dry. If you do find yourself too nervous or comfortable for whatever reason, unable to speak out, move physically closer to the person being harassed, communicate your support and your in solidarity with your physical presence. And I will hand this over now to, Sheila.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so once you have identified the need to intervene, there are many different strategies and approaches to consider for how to actually intervene. We took a lot of the strategies that we're going to cover next, mainly from an organization called Holla Back, which is a global people-powered movement to end harassment. And they outline the 5 Ds for active bystander strategies. And those are direct, distract, delegate, delay, and document. We've also drawn from several other resources here to elaborate on these intervention strategies, and you'll see the sources for each on the slides there. So depending on the situation, the context, and your personal level of comfort in intervening, you may choose one of these approaches, or you could also combine and use more than one of these. So the first approach is direct. The direct approach is an immediate, in the moment, direct response on your part to an inappropriate situation. With a direct response, you're not skirting around the issue at hand, but rather drawing immediate attention to why the situation is problematic. Because this approach can be risky if you don't know how others will respond, you might want to start out by asking a few clarifying questions to make sure you have not misunderstood the situation. So for example, did I hear correctly that you just said X, whatever it was? This will allow time also for a little bit of distraction and diffusion of the activity that could otherwise escalate. Some other things that you could say in a direct intervention could include, hey, that comment was, fill in the blank, inappropriate, disrespectful, homophobic, racist, depending on the situation. Or you could simply say something like, I'm uncomfortable with that comment. Depending on what the situation is, some other examples are, hey, Joe's pronouns are they, them, theirs. Please respect that. Or I'm interested in hearing what Mary has to say. Please stop interrupting her. So by voicing your concerns directly, other bystanders might also feel safer to voice their concerns as well, which can give you additional time to assess and respond to the situation. So the goal with a direct intervention is to succinctly stop any inappropriate behavior without further escalating the situation or putting yourself and others in a position where safety is compromised. The next approach is called distract. So if you feel uncomfortable or unable to use the direct approach, you can still intervene by interrupting the situation at hand and causing a distraction to stop harmful behavior, either by interjecting to speak to the person who's affected or by physically doing something to get in the way of the harmful interaction. So there are a lot of different examples of how you could use this distract method, but a few could be if you know the person who is being affected or who's kind of targeted by whatever the situation is. You could step in with some reason that you need to talk to them, like, hey, did you get my email? Or if you don't know the person, you could pretend like you do and greet them, change the subject, ask something like, hey, can you help me find room 435? Or do you know what, can you help me figure out what time it is? You could, rather than say something, you could accidentally on purpose spill your drink or drop your bag. Or you could just kind of pretend to be checking your phone as you accidentally on purpose wander into the middle of the situation and maybe get in between the person who is kind of perpetrating the harmful behavior and the person who's being affected. The main goal here is to divert attention away from the harmful interaction and ultimately help the person who's affected get away or regain their composure. So the third approach is delegate. With the delegation approach, you can enlist the help of friends, other bystanders, or authority figures that can be called to help with a situation if you feel unable to directly intervene or distract. At the DLF forum, for example, as we've already heard, staff and designated volunteers will have white lanyards for easy identification, so you can always find these people and report a situation that you observed. If you can't find someone in person, you can email info@diglib.org, or you can call or text 732-737-7328 for help. Depending on what the situation is, you can ask a friend for help or ask other bystanders to maybe distract or otherwise intervene while you go to find an authority figure. Another example is, somebody nearby might know the parties involved and be in a better position to intervene. The basic premise here is that you are not alone and there are colleagues that can help if intervention is needed. And as Jasmine spoke about earlier, if you are in an extreme situation where people's lives are in danger, calling 911 is an option. But if you're unsure whether or not to call 911, you might want to use the distract approach to check with the affected person to make sure they do want the police to be called. And depending on who is involved, calling the police may make the person affected feel even less safe. And then if you're unable to check with that person, please just use your best judgment. Okay, so in the delay approach, if you witness something and you're unable to take action in the moment, you can still be an active bystander by approaching the affected person after the fact. Ask them if they're okay and tell them you're sorry that happened to them. This approach is really best for harassment or comments that may happen in passing where there's really no opportunity to be direct or to distract. The main point here is to let the person who was affected know that you're here for them and acknowledge the harm that was done. Some things that you can say or do after the fact include offering specific types of help. For example, ask if they want to talk about it, or offer to accompany them to their next destination or sit with them for a while. Or, ask if they would like assistance in making a report. But no matter what, just be respectful of their response because they're probably upset by the interaction that took place and they may not, respond in the most cheerful manner. You could also choose to talk privately with the offender after the fact, especially if you know the person or are in a position to do so. Power dynamics and hierarchy come into play here. And so you may or may not feel comfortable approaching the person depending on who they are. You might be able to combine some delegation here and ask for help from somebody who does know the person or is in a position of power. The goal in approaching the offender would be to help them understand their error so that they can correct it moving forward rather than berate them for it. So this is a concept known as calling in as opposed to calling out bad behavior. And this type of conversation could be very tricky depending on how it's approached. There are a number of different resources out there for how to best approach a conversation like this, such as the Crucial Conversations method. Another good resource is the book So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo, which has a lot of good advice and a chapter specifically on how to speak to somebody about microaggressions. The main thing to remember about the delay approach is that even if you are unable to intervene in the moment, you can still take action to show support for the person who was affected and try to help mitigate future harmful behaviors. And finally, the document approach. So you might be able to help as a bystander simply by documenting an interaction by using the recording features on your phone, for example. However, if someone is, clearly being harassed and no one else is helping them, you might want to use one of the other four approaches first, the 4Ds. So a few tips for safely recording a situation include keeping a safe distance from the situation, capture landmarks and other scene identifying features, clearly state the date and time, try to capture at least 10 seconds of the interaction. And just remember that once you have a recording, you should always ask the person who was affected what they want to do with it before you post it, on social media or send it to somebody else, and just respect their decision, because really your efforts to help the situation might be in vain if you end up drawing unwanted attention to the person who was affected, and it may make them even more uncomfortable. So with all of these strategies, if we could go to the next slide, please. So again, these are the 5 Ds that are commonly referred to in active bystander intervention. And the bottom line for them really is do what you can, and with respect for the person who is affected, and use your best judgment. Clearly consider the safety of yourself and those around you. It may take practice to think on your feet and automatically know what to say and do. But, if we don't start somewhere, if we don't try and help each other, then things won't get better. So keep in mind, you can also support other active bystanders by working together, or if you notice that someone else is intervening in a situation, consider thanking them and showing support. The more we can show support for each other, the better. And I'll turn it back to Scout.
Okay, as we wrap up, let's turn to discussion of interactions in professional contexts that we really care about. I think everyone acknowledges that they can make mistakes, but it's one thing to make a mistake, and it's another to repair relationships and harm that we've caused. The other side of the coin of being an active bystander and helping lift up the code of conduct is the possibility of being that person who crossed a boundary. At least some of the time, harm is unintentional and it's a learning opportunity. In that case, what is the path back for people who've been on the wrong side of the code of conduct? Can DLF Forum also be supportive if I screw up? And what might that look like? So to ground that question, I want to present the communication recovery model. It's straightforward, but like most things, it's easier said than done. And it's on the slide there. Accepting feedback, acknowledging your impact, apologizing, asking questions for clarification, reflecting and committing to change, and moving forward in communication. What I like is that this helps, what I like about this is it helps us think about missteps as recoverable and gives us more options than we may feel that we have otherwise. And if it turns out that I'm the one who oversteps someone's boundaries, it gives me a way to attempt to repair harm and restore relationships. Okay, so we're going to move into discussion and wrap up the presentation part here. So we've chosen a few scenarios for discussion, and as we do that, I want to remind us of the principles that we've just talked about. So reality check, always check conditions on the ground before deciding what to do. Remember boundaries and agency. Remember to try to restore agency to the person being harmed. Use the 5 Ds to match your comfort level and risks with a way to interrupt or assist in what's happening. And then the communication recovery model, learn and make amends after interactions gone wrong. Okay, so here's our scenarios, and we, can someone drop into the chat again the community notes document? We have these scenarios, and we can discuss them, and then we can also take other questions for discussion that people have dropped into the community notes. So here's the 5 scenarios. There's obviously many others that could happen at DLF, but here's some common ones. So someone addresses another person using the wrong pronoun. Maybe in a lively discussion, someone interrupts a lot. You hear someone make a comment about someone else's appearance or their body. Maybe you hear a remark that is commonly used in rhetoric against a marginalized group. Or a question from the audience in a session seems intended to embarrass or confront the presenter, and the presenter tries to answer, but that person just keeps asking it in a different way. So those are our discussion questions. I guess we should maybe just start with the first one. What are some things that we could do to address when someone else uses the wrong pronoun for someone? So let's see, in the community chat, if people have questions or answers to this. This really is intended to be a discussion, because one thing that we know is that there's lots of ways to intervene without having to have it perfect. And so while it's really great to like imagine that you could think of the perfect right response in a situation, most of the time we have to think on our feet. Okay, so I see a couple in possible responses in chat. So yeah, one response would be, you know, oh hey, you know, they go by whatever, they, them, him, he. Another suggestion is to change the subject or to ask a question and model the correct pronouns. Does anyone have any other thought about how that could go?
Just want to say I love that. Change the subject and ask a question, modeling the correct pronouns. That's an excellent suggestion.
I would love to just step in and address a bit of the nuance as well. I volunteer at an LGBT center, and people being misgendered, once people leave outside, definitely happens. And I think that one crucial factor is the intention of the person doing the misgendering, or using the wrong pronoun, I'll say, pardon me. So definitely wanting to assess whether or not the person is doing this purposefully or if it's an accident. I personally do just step in, I'll very politely just say she, and the person usually apologizes and says whatever, but we do just reemphasizing, really assessing the situation and the intention of the person.
I like that, Jasmine. As someone who is regularly misgendered, I usually, if it's in a professional situation, I assume that it was a good intent, and sometimes people are sensitive to gender difference and gender non-normativity, and so they're actually trying to be inclusive when they misgender me. So I try to just assume that it was a friendly mistake, unless something about the context makes clear that it was something else. And I think that's probably a lot easier for people who had intended to be inclusive to get that information, and they're going to respond to it, appropriately, because they actually want that information and they want to do it right.
And also, in response to the modeling the correct pronouns, another helpful approach I have found is to, even if I know, for someone who's clearly uncomfortable and has not experienced addressing pronouns, sometimes I'll ask someone I know, hey, by the way, I'm sorry, what do you go as she, right? I'll kind of prompt so that the person who maybe is unfamiliar learns that it's okay to ask pronouns in terms of modeling correct behavior.
Yeah, totally. It's okay. It's okay to ask. And I think that I think that everyone who's affected by that feels that way, though obviously it's still sensitive. Any other thoughts on this topic? We could move on to the next one if no one does. There's two comments in chat. For example, later on you could let the person who misgendered someone know the other person's proper pronouns. And I think that's a good one, because often, like, imagine it's in a plenary session or something like that. You can't, without making people uncomfortable, you can't address it right then. So you could go, you could find them afterwards. Yeah, I see a follow-up there with, taking the person's lead. So if a person is being misgendered, kind of taking cues from them. Okay, so let's we can continue taking thoughts about that in chat and circle back if we need to, and obviously people can read and chat themselves. But let's move on to the next one. So I think this is like a common kind of one scenario. In a lively discussion, someone is continually interrupting someone else, and I think that we can envision two ways that goes. One is someone is so enthusiastic about what the other person is saying that they interrupt. And most of the time it could be okay, but sometimes it's not. And then there's a kind of talking over. So we could potentially think about ways of handling that scenario, depending on what we think the intention is.
I've had this happen before in, like, for example, small roundtable discussions, even where it's not even a full room of people, but just a handful of people, and, trying to equitably, go around the circle and allow time for everyone to share their thoughts, and then having one person be kind of continually cut off or interrupted. And not necessarily in a, bad intentioned way. It's not like the other people were purposefully trying to cut the other person off. It's just they were continuing to just think out loud with their own thoughts, and it was interrupting, the time that was going to be allocated for another person to share their thoughts. So just, I think, being aware and noticing when that's happening is the first step. And then, I'd say, like, in the scenario that I was in, I was kind of making eye contact with the person that was being interrupted, and there was kind of this shared understanding of, like, hey, I'm trying to talk, and everybody else continues to talk. So I, spoke up and said, hey, we haven't heard from, this person yet. Can we please just give them a chance to, you know, say what they think? So being kind of a supporter and bystander in that way. Curious to hear if other people have been in situations or what other people think might be good responses to something like this.
Sheila, a friend of mine told me about a similar scenario where she was an audience member, and the person who was taking questions, I think was probably the presenter as well, but at any rate, that person was like pretty pointedly only calling on people that they appeared to know, and they were all men. And finally, there was a guy near her who noticed this, and he raised his hand. And then when he was called on, he said, "I raised my hand so that you'd call on her." And so she got to ask her question. But I think that's like a really good opportunity for people to pay attention to what's going on in the room, so that they can use their privilege in a way that makes sure that everybody is heard. There's some good suggestions in the chat. We've scrolled past. Erin O'Donnell mentioned a related thing to the last topic about a friend of hers helping her know that she would wanted to be referred to as Black and the reason why. So that's worth reading over and thinking about. Courtney and Sarah also have some suggestions. So I think those are really great. And I'm sorry, I inadvertently moved the slide. That happens from time to time because of my mouse. If you touch it, it does things. So we have about 13 minutes left in the session. I want to keep moving through the scenarios to make sure that we spend at least a minute or two on them. So this other one I think is, you know, really common. You overhear someone make a comment about someone else's appearance or body size. I think it's really, it can be common in some circles, you know, to remark on someone's weight gain or weight loss, or other remarks about people's bodies. So how do we handle this?
I'm going to briefly step in here on this one, just because I am a person whose weight constantly fluctuates, and have relatives come from a culture where that is commonly pointed out. And so it is something I have no tolerance for. I bring this up because we talk about situations in which you personally can be triggered or personally can be very uncomfortable with. And when that happens, oftentimes I just go, no, I'm not very nice about it. I'm not rude or necessarily aggressive either, but I'm not going to, I will say that that's uncalled for, inappropriate, or depending on the scenario, but I'm going to very blatantly say, like, that is, you know, I don't think that's an appropriate point of conversation. I usually am a very direct intervener in that way, because I recognize how damaging that talk can be. Particularly from a stranger, because it's bad from family, but then it just really reinforces it when someone you don't know and you feel unempowered to. It can be catch you off guard. You're like, why is this random stranger talking about me? So I like to let someone know they're not alone, but I also, for me personally, as a larger size woman, will be the first one to say that's not okay. But wanting to ground that in my own perspective, to say, like I said, we had a previous example to say that can be triggering for you personally.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine. There's some really good comments in the chat about this right now, and I feel like very much this is one, like, you know, my impulse is always to kind of be deflective and like distracting, but for me personally, this feels like something that you have to say, and it's something like, look, other people's bodies aren't for you to comment on, or look, let's try and have a good relationship with food and not toxic, this kind of toxic food talk, anything like that, to just sort of mark it as like, whoa, you know. And I know this is this is a hard one because again, it's like there's gender norms attached with that, where lots of times, say between women or between men, it's okay to be like, you know, oh, look at your six pack or, you know, whatever, and like talk about each other's bodies in that way. And I feel like that this needs to be marked out in conversation, especially potentially at a professional conference where we know that that's that's not okay. But do people have other suggestions for how we could approach this in a way that feels slightly less confrontational? And I see a comment in here that's something like saying, instead of saying you look great, you can say it's great to see you. And I think that's a really good one, you know, because you know what, it's always great to see someone that you care about, even if they actually aren't looking that well that day. Maybe they are under the weather or tired. So, but do people have other suggestions about how you could interrupt or address commenting on bodies?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like if you can't think of what to say, and I think this goes for any scenario where it's like somebody said something and you're kind of just like awkward, like what do I say? Um, if you can't think of something specific, you can always just say, hey, that comment made me uncomfortable. Um, and that could be kind of an entryway to, you know, discuss it further, or you could just leave it at that. Um, but yeah, that would be my kind of go-to, is just, and it's hard. I mean, it will probably take practice to even feel comfortable enough to speak up and say that a comment made you feel uncomfortable, even if you're not the person who is on the receiving end, even as a bystander. Just in those awkward situations, it's like, yeah, that comment made me uncomfortable and maybe wasn't, you know, appropriate for this setting, or, you know, that kind of thing. Um,
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. I think that you bring it back to, you know, we don't have to be perfect, but we can interrupt it. And so I don't know that we'll get a 100% perfect answer for all scenarios, but interrupting, like you say. Someone else suggested just like helping them move on, dump the bad conversation rather than repeat it. Okay, let's move on to the next, and just in the interest of time, because I think we could keep thinking about it. So this is one, someone makes a remark that is commonly used in rhetoric against a marginalized group. So, you know, it's one thing you hear an epithet or, you know, something that we know is a sort of, you know, a foul term for another group of people, but there's also more subtle kinds of rhetoric. So how do we interrupt that? How do we respond to that?
Just because my comment's pretty quick and I'm going to then leave it for other people, I always throw statistics. I ask questions. So if someone says that, I'll go, oh, what's the statistics on that? And then I'll ask even more like drilling questions. Well, why are the numbers like that? I'm African American and Central American, and neither of those demographics are particularly popular in certain circles right now. And things like, well, the crime rates in Black neighborhoods. So I'll be like, well, what are the crime rates? What are the statistics? Where are you pulling those numbers? Oh, well, what are the intervening like variables? Just to force them to think about it to some degree and also make them uncomfortable if that's necessary.
Yes, I think sometimes it is necessary to make someone a little uncomfortable for a minute. But it's hard to make, it's uncomfortable to make someone feel uncomfortable too.
yeah, I'll chime in just saying, um, you know, it will obviously depend on what the scenario is, but, and I don't know, it's probably more likely to be like, you know, some sort of microaggression than just an outright, you know, statement, but you never know. But I think, you know, in many cases, if it is a microaggression, the person might not have even realized that they said something offensive. So just drawing attention to that, like restating what they, um, what just happened? Like, oh, hey, you just like, I don't know, assumed that, I don't know, whatever it is. And then, yeah, just asking the questions like, well, why did you say that? Or, you know, how exactly was I supposed to, interpret what you just said? It came off as, racist or what have you. That would be my approach.
Yeah, I think that dovetails with a couple comments in the chat right now. For example, saying, I'm not sure if you're aware, but that term is offensive to folks in that community. You could say, I am sure you didn't mean to, but you sound kind of, that sounds kind of racist. Or that sounds like it could be offensive. Have you thought about that? Oh, this is good. Now we're getting some good comments in the chat. Does anyone else want to read one of these out loud or offer one before we move on to our last scenario? Okay, so there's some good responses in there, and the last one I think is suggestive that like a lot of times people don't know, and they don't want to be offensive, and they actually will adjust how they do things if you can find a way of talking with them about it. So this last one I think is something that we've seen in conferences, possibly more at some kinds of conferences than others, but there's a question from the audience. And maybe it's confrontational to the presenter, and the presenter gamely tries to answer, but the audience member continues with the confrontation. So what's a way that we could think about to interrupt that? I mean, maybe it's just, maybe this is where it's helpful for moderators to just step in and say, you asked your question, we're moving on, or something like that, to just really put a boundary around that. Any other thoughts? Has anyone seen or experienced this in a session? For me, there's a sort of flip side where what if a presenter in their presentation actually does the thing that's right above, enacts the scenario that's right above, which is that they invoke some stereotypes or use rhetoric that they may or may not be aware, punches down on a marginalized group. So you can imagine a situation in which a presenter or an audience member is then trying to call them on that. And so this one seems a little bit sticky to me.
Yeah, this one seems like it would be really, really dependent on what the actual scenario is. Like, did the two people know each other? Like, what's the relationship? Or is it just a complete stranger? What's like the demographic difference between the two people? But again, potentially, just speaking up and saying, hey, this interaction is a little bit uncomfortable, or saying, hey, can we give the presenter a chance to answer the question, or hey, can you clarify your question, or just trying to read the scenario and at least say something that will help. I don't know, it's hard.
I think that my first question is just the one, once again, who's responsible for moderating this session, and having the moderator, if so, that's their responsibility to step in, regardless of previous interaction. I mean, from the perspective of someone who has moderated something kind of like this, it's not the time or the place. So and you don't have to direct it really. Like for me, my approach should just be, hey, if we could keep it to one question, or if you could let the presenter finish speaking before you re-interrupt, just to really recenter it around policy, like around the rules or the appropriate etiquette of audience presenter engagement, as opposed to making it personal about the question that was asked. If the question was really inappropriate, being like, thank you for rephrasing, that first question was, I think, verged on verged on inappropriate or something, some language to indicate that it was inappropriate. But the situation it does depend on the situation. I agree, the situation. It depends on the situation, I'm sorry.
Thanks, Jasmine. I appreciate you bringing that back to what we had talked about in terms of like figuring out, is there someone here who can be in charge of this situation? Some conferences, there's not necessarily a moderator in the room, but at a lot of conferences there are. And so I think this is a good opportunity also to make sure that moderators feel empowered to do something like this. And then potentially approach either the presenter or the audience member after the fact, when the session is over, to try and address it that way. So we're at an hour, and I'm not really surprised that that we still have so much that we could talk about, and there's many other scenarios that we could talk about. But we're gonna have to close it here. There's been some talk about potentially having something at the forum, or having a another web meeting that's just open conversation. So we haven't made a decision on that, but we're thinking about how we can continue conversations for people who do. This recording will be made available later, so there is that. So just stay tuned, and if you want further information, or want to be made aware if we have another session on this, you can email DLF. I'm not going to say who at this moment, but they'll figure out how to get it. You can also, Sheila sent this out to the DLF forum list a couple days ago, so you can respond to her. And DLF is saying they will put a contact, or they will put the information on the active bystander page that you have linked to. So keep your eye on that. All right, we really appreciate your attendance. It looks like there's about 40 some odd participants when we first got going. And for those of you who will be at DLF Forum, look forward to seeing you. Feel free to come up to any of us and continue the conversation. All right, it looks like we're gonna sign off. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.